to this HRS Presents special report on human trafficking in Appalachian, Ohio. I'm Reggie Robinson, Community Coordinator for Health Recovery Services. Human trafficking is a crime in which people profit from the control and exploitation of others. Human trafficking is one of the fastest growing criminal industries in the world. Annually, the money illegally acquired through human trafficking is estimated to be more than $35 billion, which equals the profits earned by Starbucks, Google, and Nike combined. U.S. human traffickers use violence, threats, deception, debt bondage, and other manipulative tactics to force people to engage in commercial sex or to provide labor or services against their will. Victims of human trafficking include children and adults aged 18 or over who are coerced or deceived into commercial sex acts, and anyone forced into different forms of labor or services, such as domestic workers held in a home or farm workers forced to labor against their will. This illegal industry has largely been hidden in the shadows, but human trafficking cases have been reported in all 50 states, including our state of Ohio. According to the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, Ohio has ranked as high as 5th among all states in total reported human trafficking cases, with Toledo being identified as the 4th highest ranking city in the nation for recruiting victims into this illegal trade. While numerous coalitions have been formed to combat human trafficking in Ohio and around the country, there are few in Southeastern Ohio. That's why we are pleased to welcome today as our special guest, Dr. Christi Bartman, the CEO of the nonprofit consulting firm Basic Concepts Limited. Dr. Bartman has created Eyes Up Appalachia, an initiative to illuminate, educate, and activate our Southeastern Ohio communities against human trafficking. Let's get right to a recent interview I conducted with Dr. Christi Bartman. The information in this presentation is meant to educate the audience on human trafficking, what it is, how to recognize it, what makes one vulnerable, and what to do about it. It does contain several examples of situations which demonstrate human trafficking in rural environments. For this reason, parental discretion is advised. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of HRS Presents. Today, we're excited to introduce to our viewing audience Dr. Christi Bartman. Dr. Bartman, welcome to the program. You know, if I were to rattle off the entire list of your impressive accomplishments, that alone would probably take up our entire show. You're an educator, certified professional coach, and owner of a nonprofit consulting business who holds, in addition to your PhD, a master's in public administration and a Juris Doctor degree. You're involved in a number of projects that are close to your heart and have done groundbreaking work in a variety of fields. It's indeed an honor to have you with us.
Thanks, Reggie. It's an honor to be here.
Today, you're here to talk with us about Eyes Up Appalachia, an initiative you began to deal with human trafficking. Why did you decide to start Eyes Up Appalachia?
One of the things that I've been doing for the last 10 years or so is working peripherally with anti-human trafficking efforts, be they law, legislative, advocacy efforts, and I really didn't have as much time as I wanted to, but I started to hear some bigger issues come through, and one of those was that they don't have human trafficking, anti-human trafficking coalitions down in Southeast Ohio. And I left my job in academia last year to really focus my time on human trafficking in Ohio, and I wanted to approach the bigger efforts. So one of the biggest issues that we had was that lack of a coalition. So in Ohio, human trafficking is somewhat overseen by coalitions because it's such a local community um, dynamic. So what human trafficking is in Columbus or Cincy is very different than what it looks like in a rural community, and particularly in Appalachian, Ohio. And so I got some funding from ARC and to do a study on creating a coalition down in Southeastern Ohio. And I wasn't sure what that might look like, but the more I have gotten into this study and the more I have met with individuals and groups like Gaia CPR and others, it's come to light that there are coalitions already in place. They don't look at human trafficking, that's not their focus, but it's made up of the same members that a coalition would be made up of that address human trafficking. So that would be like your social service agencies, your courts, your police, your law enforcement, medical personnel, mental health personnel. All those people address and see and touch human trafficking victims, as well as opioid addiction, suicide, and a lot of the coalitions that currently exist are formed around those other entities. And so the more I looked at it, the more I thought it's probably a good idea, instead of creating another coalition with the same people, to try to work through current coalitions that are already in existence through either an individual on that coalition that has more of a human trafficking lens, or maybe a subcommittee. So I'm working through that and I'm thinking through that right now. But what really came to light is there are a lot of individuals that have a concern and a passion to help the community in this and many other ways, but they don't have the resources. And so the state has the Governor's Task Force for Human Trafficking, and the AG's office has their human trafficking initiative. But a lot of the things aren't really getting down into the communities in Southeastern Ohio. And so that led me to Eyes Up Appalachia. So looking at the coalition map, it is all the Appalachian counties. And in fact, while I was doing the study, the Northeast counties that were covered by a coalition fell off, and they're not covered either. So there's about 16 counties of the 33 Appalachian counties in Ohio that are not covered by a coalition. And so it doesn't make sense to have a giant coalition. You just would not be able to do that. But to have this Eyes Up initiative to help communities deal with it within their communities, within existing coalitions, sounded like the right way to go. And so that's the impetus behind Eyes Up.
So what are your initial goals for Eyes Up Appalachia?
It is really to educate the community. It is not we're not providing services. It is simply to illuminate, educate, and activate within the community. So to reach within the different communities and educate them on exactly what human trafficking is. A lot of the issues behind this in rural areas particularly is that it's what does it look like? A lot of people are under the incorrect assumption that it's an international thing, that the international individuals come in and that's what it looks like, or that there's a white van that pulls up in the parking lot and kidnaps somebody and pulls away. It's not like that at all. It's much more within the family, within the community, that you're not seeing. And a lot of the time you may even see it, but it's not called human trafficking, that term. And even like when we talk to juveniles that have been trafficked, they don't know that term, they don't use that term. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, is educate the community on exactly what it looks like, and give them some resources to help, offer to connect them with some trainings. So for medical professionals, for law enforcement, for courts, for the community themselves, for church groups, for teachers particularly, what does it look like for the students? What does grooming look like online? So, that older man that's complimenting you and introducing you to things like drugs and other things, that may have more of an ulterior motive than you think. And so those are the type of things that I plan to do, is simply get the education effort out there to the communities.
And I think you already partially answered this, but you mentioned partnering with coalitions. What other kinds of entities and individuals are you going to partner with?
Right now, the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio has graciously come forward to be my fiscal sponsor. So I will partner with them and work with them, and through them to get this word out. And I will also, Gallia CPR has again been wonderful. They were my initial effort into this community to find out exactly what was and was not covered and happening, and what interest there was. And I can't tell you, I just have been blown away by the care and concern that they show for the community, and the interest that they have in bringing this within that group. And between the coalitions, there are a number of task force, like opiate task forces out there. There are suicide coalition prevention groups that are also made up of the same individuals that I want to touch base with. And then the schools. Teachers are so important, and particularly right now with COVID and with everything, starting, whether it's in person or online, teachers are one of the keys to identifying issues. And so reaching the school systems, reaching the teachers, that's another part of it. But also, community awareness, general community awareness.
Thank you. Well, I understand that you've developed a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to invite you at this time to share your screen and give us some more information about what human trafficking looks like in Appalachian, Ohio.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time and sitting with me this morning to go through exactly what human trafficking is. This is going to be just a quick introduction, and I invite you to contact me, and we can certainly talk further about it. But this is Eyes Up Appalachia. And the definition of human trafficking, this is something that is many times unclear to individuals exactly what human trafficking is. And now this is somewhat of a legal definition. It is the National Trafficking Victims of Protection Act definition, and it defines human trafficking as severe forms of human trafficking, such as commercial sex act, when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or the person performing that act is under 18, or the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude. And most everybody, individuals understand that inducing someone to perform a commercial sex act for something of value, people think money in exchange, but it's also an exchange for drugs. It's an exchange for rent. It's an exchange for a place to stay, other things of value. So consider that when you're thinking through that. And also labor. A lot of people think of agriculture labor in the trafficking industry, and that is a big part of it. But there's also forestry. There is domestic servitude, such as working within a home, or working within nail salons and other things. So those definitions are a bit more expansive. And we'll talk in a few minutes about exactly what forced fraud and coercion does look like. Now, Polaris is the national organization that controls the national hotline. And when you look at that and you see the state rankings, Ohio is constantly ranked 4th and 5th in the nation. And you kind of take that with a grain of salt, because on the one hand, we do have a problem. We have a human trafficking problem. But on the other hand, we have also done a really good job in North and Central Ohio in education and advocacy efforts. And that's one of the reasons I want to do the same, to build those efforts down in Southern Ohio. In 2018, you see the cases were 41,000, contacts with human trafficking hotline with 10,900 cases reported through that. In 2019, you saw that grow, 48,326 contacts with the trafficking hotline, 11,500 cases. And here's kind of the key I want you to pay attention to is 27% of the calls came from the community. So you can see that people are starting to think about it, starting to ask questions about it, starting to understand what it looks like. And so of those 11,500 cases that were reported last year, 72% were sex trafficking, 11% were labor, and over 81% were female. So trafficking victims are not always female, but there is a large majority being reported. But that doesn't mean that boys, men are not trafficking victims as well. Now we talked a little bit, you saw fraud, force, and coercion in the definition. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. Under sex trafficking, abuse, substance abuse, 80 to 90% of trafficking victims are addicted to some substance, whether it be opioid or meth or otherwise. Sometimes that is utilized by the trafficker to control them and to start to get them addicted and dependent on them. And sometimes the person is already an addict and they are exploited because of that by a trafficker. And so the others are physical abuse, sexual abuse, intimidation. And sometimes the intimidation is like a threat, a major threat, weapons, harm your family. But sometimes a lot of it is emotional abuse and this intimacy related, you see, because a lot of the times the victims feel like they're not victims. They feel like they chose this. They feel like they're very ashamed of it, but they feel like it's their fault. And that's part of what we need to do, is to make sure they understand that this is not their fault. They did not choose this. Labor trafficking, some of what fraud, force, and coercion looks like there is withholding of pay or earnings, excessive work hours, a threat to report to immigration if they are immigrants, verbal abuse, or withhold and denies other needs such as housing, transportation, water, electricity. We've had a case that did that as well. So those are what amount to fraud, force, and coercion within a trafficking setting. Now, the vulnerabilities are very important, because one of the other things, Reggie, that I wanted to do, that I want to do with Eyes Up, is to help prevent and address these vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities of poverty, vulnerabilities of lack of education, of drug abuse. And so I want to work with the community that's already working with these, because if we can address these vulnerabilities, there's less of an opportunity for someone to take advantage and traffic another individual. But what this looks like for sex trafficking, again, substance use, that's huge. That is huge. Runaways, again, right up there with substance abuse. Runaways are just the top population from which traffickers recruit. Homeless youth. Recent migration is another one, somebody coming into either the area or the country. Unstable housing is one that we see frequently, in and out of homeless shelters and others. And then mental health concerns. And then if you look at labor trafficking, again, recent migration is a much bigger part of that. Unstable housing, criminal record, criminal history, physical health, and substance use. And I'll give you an example of the labor trafficking. We had a big case in Lima, Ohio, called the Trillium Egg Farms. And this was busted a few years ago. Ended up being a big sting operation. But what happened was, in this case, it was international. And so the individuals were from Guatemala, and the trafficker had recruited them from Guatemala, paid or taken the mortgages from their families' homes in order to bring these individual young men to the United States, supposedly for education and job potential. They got here, they took all their papers, they lived in complete squalor on this egg farm. They worked nonstop. They were not able to transport themselves. They were threatened, their families were threatened. And so that is an example of what labor trafficking looks like in Ohio, has happened. It's not like it's a made-up example. That's exactly something that happened here. So that's one of the things that we have to look at. In rural communities, specifically, part of the issue is a lack of awareness of what human trafficking looks like, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. A lack of adequate services. One of the things that I'm working on that study, and I'm working with some of the coalitions and others, like, Reggie helps me identify, what services are available, and then where the gaps are, gap in housing, gap in detox facilities, other things like that. And so that works across vulnerable populations as a whole, not just trafficking. Limited transportation. So you've got somebody that needs to go to counseling, because a lot of the counseling for mental health with a trafficking victim is extremely complex because of all the trauma that they've been through. And sometimes the counseling is not in the area, so they need transportation, and sometimes that's hard. Lack of adequate funding, definitely. A lack of training for medical, law enforcement, and court personnel. It's not that they don't want to, it's just that maybe this position is one deep in this small county, and they just don't have a heck of a lot of time. Or maybe it just hasn't been offered yet, and hopefully that's something that I can help with. Most youth trafficked in rural areas are trafficked by family members or someone they knew in the neighborhood. That's what makes it so hard. That's what makes it so difficult, because the individual, particularly if they're a juvenile, there's a stigma of coming forward. I mean, that's, this is your uncle, this is your mom. I mean, this is hard. They feel like it's their fault. It's difficult. It is very, very difficult. And sometimes, a lot of the time, these sex trafficking crimes show up as abuse, prostitution, sexual assault, abandonment, or kidnapping. Those, and particularly, even if there are triggers or indicators of human trafficking, if somebody's prosecuting it, or if law enforcement is arresting for it and charging for it, if they feel that they can get a better result by charging sexual assault, which their case may be better for that, they'll charge that instead of trying to go and bring in human trafficking, particularly if it's not something that the community is used to, or the courts are used to there. And so they're still working towards the same end, but that's one of the reasons that it doesn't show up, it doesn't show up as human trafficking. Additional reasons, again, rural communities, geographical separation. It's harder. It's just harder to see. And with the schools right now, with things, depending on whether they go back online or how that works, it is more difficult to see. But I've got to say that teachers are just so important in this effort. And in fact, a number of those cases that have come to light have been teachers that have simply asked follow-on questions when they see something. And that has made all the difference. Lack of economic opportunities, poverty, not able to get out of the situation, drug and alcohol abuse, cultural beliefs. So if the male is the breadwinner, and the woman ends up having to stay home, that creates a complete dependency on the spouse, and that sometimes is hard to overcome. Encourages children to work earlier, possibly risky jobs, and also truck stop proximity. There are issues with truck stops and trafficking. There is an organization called Truckers Against Trafficking, and so there's obviously a positive effort on that group, but it's also, increases the risk in the area. And so those are things that we need to be aware of and be careful of. And so let's bring this home a little bit. Let's bring this back into Southeastern Ohio. These are the unintentional drug overdoses by county. And the darker the color of the county, the higher the percentage is per 100,000 of their population. And so this is averaged out, so you should be able to compare. So you'll see Gallia County is the darkest shade of blue. You'll see down in Southern Ohio here, also Lawrence Jackson. You'll see this whole area is one that we need to pay attention to and to be concerned about regarding the use of opioids and other drugs. I know that I'm talking to everybody here that fully understands the poverty that is seen in this area. You look at this map here, and you see Southern Ohio, Southeastern Ohio, Athens, Benton, Meigs, Jackson, Gallia, all in red here, which is the 20 to 30% percentage of population in poverty. These are the things that make it very difficult to overcome for some of these vulnerable populations, human trafficking survivors and victims as part of that. But so let me kind of wrap up here. I want to tell you a bit about what maybe to look for and some steps to take. If you are looking, these again, you can see this in many different ways. This is not the only thing, but Just overall, an individual that appears submissive, nervous, or scared with an individual they don't look like they maybe should not be with, or a situation in which they probably should not be. Has an inconsistent story or relationship in a living situation. So say they're telling a teacher, say, I know a lot of the schools have a person on administration that helps with homeless youth. And so if there's an inconsistent story that when they're talking to them about where they live and relationships, something maybe to follow up on. Doesn't control their documents or money. That's important. I mean, a juvenile is one thing, but an adult is another. Inappropriately dressed for the weather or the age. In presence of a controlling male or female. This is very important. Particularly, say, given an emergency room situation. If you've got a male bringing a female in, that the male does all the talking. The female is not allowed to speak. She's not left alone. Those are things that might be an indication you might want to look further. And again, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that male-female. There are other females that help recruit and manage other females as part of a trafficking ring. In fact, there was someone in Jackson County that was arrested for that earlier in the year, I believe. Signs of physical, mental, or emotional abuse. And again, some of the counselors, this is going to come up with some of the counselors, not able to come and go when they want to, and in possession of multiple motel key cards, prepaid cells, things like that. There was an instance in one of the Appalachian, Ohio counties where a teacher identified a young girl, I believe she was 11 or 12, that was just acting out. And she said, she finally, asked the question, what's wrong? Why can't we get this done? And the girl says, I don't want to go see that man again this weekend. And so that, thank God, had the teacher ask further questions. And it ended up that the mother was trafficking this young girl to 70-plus-year-old man on the weekends for $20 and a pack of cigarettes. And, it just breaks your heart to hear these stories. And these are actual stories of what happens. So it's so important that people look for the signs and at least ask the questions, follow-on questions. Labor trafficking, appears to live where they're employed. Transported in a group by an employer, not allowed to have their own transportation. Restricted movement, doesn't control their identification documents. This is a bigger one here for labor trafficking. Especially if somebody's coming in from out of the country, they'll take the documents, they'll take the visa documents, they'll take the passports and everything else, and won't allow them to have them. Doesn't control their documents, earning below minimum wage, so doing the work but not getting the pay. Indebtedness to the employer, signs of physical abuse, isolation, malnutrition, and working long hours in poor conditions. These are all things that will at least create the need for questions. One of the recent, this is just last month or June, one of the most recent cases was done in Scioto County. 9 were arrested and charged with the connection of human trafficking involving drugs exchanged for sexual access to children. So this man and his family members and contacts were out finding people within the community that would bring their children to him for his use in exchange for drugs. And so this is an ongoing investigation, but this is just one very recent example of what it might look like, or what it does look like in rural Ohio, and some of the things that we need to be watching for. So finally, to the positive side of this, what can you do to help? When we looked at those national hotline numbers, this is a breakdown of the points of access for help that they went to. So you've got friends and family. That's so important. That's one of the reasons why I want to educate the community, because they'll see it first. Law enforcement and criminal justice. Again, is that person a criminal or a victim? Is there fraud, force, or coercion involved, or are they seriously, doing this on their own? Health services, so very important, because they will see it. I was talking to a group of nurses, ER nurses, the other day, and what they see is a series of coming to the emergency room for different things, and they build each time. And so they're trying to figure out a way. So how can I look at this and see when this starts to look like a trafficking case and intervene before it goes so far wrong? Mobile apps and social media. Really starting to be popular, obviously. Not can be used for negative, but also can be used for positive. And then the child welfare system, very important in identifying these issues. And finally, how can you help? What can you do? Learn to recognize the signs. Just some of the things that I told you. Those are general indicators. But if a situation makes you concerned, follow up with some questions if possible. Don't put yourself in danger, obviously, and don't put anyone else in danger, but follow up. Help alleviate underlying vulnerabilities. These are the poverty, lack of education. There's so many organizations within Southeast Ohio that are working on this, and I want to join them and try to work that as well. And also, if you have a concern or if you see something, call the hotline. That number, 888-3737, 888, or better yet, text, it's Be Free, so 233-733. Talking to the hotline and talking to people that have called the hotline, there is a longer wait time, because if you get on and they're trying to help, they have to make a lot of different calls to get that help. And so they're seeing an increased use in the text function, and they suggest an increased use of the text function. So I will definitely suggest that to you and leave that with you. And I will stop sharing my screen and start talking to Reggie again.
Well, Dr. Bartman, thank you so much for sharing this information. It's incredibly important, but it's horrific and so infuriating. Why isn't this a national priority, dealing with human trafficking?
Reggie, part of it is the lack of statistical background for these larger decisions to be made. So on the one hand, over the last decade, huge leaps forward have been made in addressing this issue and bringing it to the forefront by national and state and local agencies. But on the other hand, it is very hard to collect data for this. So one of the reasons, and I'm working on a subcommittee with the Attorney General's Human Trafficking Initiative on data and research in this area and the gaps that exist. So on the one hand, some of the reporting is voluntary. So some of the reporting by law enforcement and others is voluntary. Some of it is based on what is charged. So if the crime of human trafficking is not what's charged, then it doesn't get reported. It gets reported as something else. Some of it is the fact that the different agencies that see it, say some of the nonprofit agencies, Salvation Army, others that work with this population, they have their own internal system, but it doesn't necessarily feed up into one place that's collecting all the data. Some of the different entities are mandatory reporters, like some of the child enforcement agencies, child welfare agencies, and so you do get some of that data. But when you get data from 2 or 3, say somebody's involved, a juvenile's involved in a multi-system process, so each of the systems is a mandatory reporter and they'll report up, but they take all the identifying data out of that for obvious reasons. And then you're not sure, is this a duplicate? Is this, it's very hard, very hard to get clean data. And the national agency, you see the data from the national hotline. Part of that is, so Ohio is 4th or 5th, it bounces back and forth. But so is that because we have really good observant people that are making calls and they're asking questions, and it may or may not be a trafficking situation? Or is it because we have a horrible problem? We still don't quite know yet. So we're working all those angles. We're trying to, in fact, we're meeting with the AG's initiative next month to talk more about that and how we might better pull that data together and bring that forward, so we have one base from which to draw, so we really truly know what the numbers are.
Well, you cited tens of thousands of reported cases, and I'm certain that those survivors have endured a great deal of trauma and are desperately in need of trauma-informed care. A concern that I have is our system, is our capacity in being increased to deal with that?
I think that's localized, Reggie. Some I would say yes. Some there's access. As long as the issues are identified, then there's help available. But when we start talking rural communities, it's more of a hit and miss. Some areas have it, some don't. And so it's important for us to continue these conversations with all the different caregivers, because that is, like you said, that trauma-informed care is so important, and it is certainly a comprehensive effort. So it involves not only the mental health, but it involves the addiction recovery sources, it involves the housing, it involves legal help. So, you know, if a person's trafficked and they've gotten an eviction and they've gotten some other record based on that trafficking, can they get those expunged? And can they get those off the record? Because it's very hard for somebody, you know, whether a trafficking victim or not, when they have evictions, when they have criminal records, to get any other housing that's safe. And so all those things have to come together. But you're right. I mean, it's a comprehensive process, and it's a matter of us all working together and finding the gaps and trying to fill those gaps.
We certainly have a lot of work to do to fully address this issue. So what are the next steps for Eyes Up Appalachia?
I am really looking forward to working with the communities and getting the word out. My first effort working with the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio is to have a site, you know, a website within their periphery, and then to start on some media campaigns. It's important that we just start addressing this issue in the ways we can. This, you know, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. That this is one way we can do it. But a media issue, media out into the community, such as through the libraries, maybe, and where it can reach individuals, maybe through the food pantries. That is going to be my first drive, is to push it out that way. There's also a movie called The Turnout that was produced by an individual that was teaching at OU at the time, and is based around a real life trafficking situation in Chansey and Southeastern Ohio, in that area. And so I am going to see if I can get a premiere for Southeast Ohio of that as well. So those are kind of the first efforts I'm looking at. But mainly I'm working on making connections within the communities, offering services that I can help with from the state, you know, whether it's trainings or handouts, you know, just information, whatever. I'm not a service provider. Eyes Up is not going to provide services, but my hope is that I will be able to help connect those services that are out there with the groups that see what's happening in the community and can help.
Thank you. We've been speaking with Christi Bartman, the founder of Eyes Up Appalachia, a human trafficking initiative. Dr. Bartman, thank you so very much for all the very important work that you're doing on so many fronts. We hope that we can invite you back to our program for future updates on Eyes Up Appalachia and any other initiatives that you're involved with.
Thank you, Reggie. I appreciate it.
For more information, you can contact Dr. Bartman at christybartman@me.com. And remember, the toll-free number for the Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-3737-888. Once again, 1-888-3737-888. I think that's wrong, isn't it?
Nope, that's correct. That makes it easier to remember, actually, because you've got the 888-3737-888.
Okay.
You can also text 233-733 or Be Free. And please, everyone, let's band together and deal with this incredibly horrible issue. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Bartman, and thank you all for watching.
Everyone has a role in ending human trafficking. To report a tip, connect with anti-trafficking services in your area, or for information about anti-trafficking resources, call the national hotline number at 1-888-3737-888. It's toll-free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day. You can also text HELP or INFO to 233-733. Thank you.